Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HTM here, and in this video we're going to talk about how I successfully solo group dungeons in the Elder Scrolls Online and how you can do it too. So whether you want to farm Undaunted keys or motifs during the Undaunted event, farm gear sets or experience, or just challenge yourself to do something different, this video will give you the tools that you need to solo some of the most challenging content in the game, and our list starts right now. Right, so I've been thinking about soloing dungeons again, ESO, as I've been testing out builds, but also because we're currently smack dab in the middle of the Undaunted event, and I want some motifs. That's basically it. So hopefully this video comes at the right time for you. We'll be covering a lot of basics here, so make sure to check out the timestamps below if you need to skip ahead or rewatch any of the sections. And also, just in case you're not sure of how this works, basically you can solo enter a dungeon at any time, and you do this without using the group finder. Instead, you just walk right up to the dungeon, you zone in just like any other zone, or if you've already discovered a dungeon, then you can just teleport there as well. It's really easy. Remember that dungeons can also be set to either normal or veteran difficulty. Now, normal is going to be much easier for soloing. That's because enemies in normal have much less health, they hit you for less damage, and so you can generally clear those instances a lot faster. Veteran will be much harder because enemies there are going to have more health and do more damage to you. You can still solo in veteran dungeons and the rewards are better. You get monster helms, for example, but it will take a bit more time. That being said, let's jump to the first tip on our list, which has to do with gear and consumables. And many players believe that you need to have the best gold quality gear in order to progress in ESO, and that's really not the case most of the time. Purple quality gear, even blue or green, is completely fine, and in most cases, the benefits of actually upgrading your gear to gold is really small, like not even worth it in some cases. The only exception to this rule, though, is your weapon, especially your front bar weapon. Upgrading that weapon to gold quality is going to give you a huge boost to your weapon and spell damage in ESO. So golding out that piece of gear specifically and doing that first, that should be your first priority on any build. For example, you can see on this Templar with a gold lightning staff that states a value of 1335 damage on the tooltip. But what does that actually mean? Well, when I switch over to my character stats, that's getting my build to roughly 3000 or so unbuffed spell damage. Now let's say that I didn't upgrade my staff. Let's say that I left it at blue quality like this other staff that I just picked up. This staff shows a value of 1108 damage on the tooltip, which if I then go back to my stat sheet and I compare that, I'm now at roughly 2600 spell damage, meaning I lost about 400 total spell damage on my build by not upgrading this weapon. Keep in mind, these are just unbuffed stats, and once you factor in your character buffs like Major Brutality, Major Sorcery, the difference becomes even bigger. So again, upgrading your weapons, that is your #1 goal on any build. Going along with that, consumables are just important. You always want to make sure you have your food running. You want to make sure you have potions active. Keep in mind, potions are not just about returning resources. They actually give you specific buffs, buffing your recoveries by 30% depending on which type of potion you're using. So this is, again, a huge boost that you don't want to forget about. If you plan on soloing for a while, make sure you pick up the usual things. Repair kits are helpful, soul gems. Especially if you're playing with a companion, they might die, you might need to revive them in combat. Soul gems are important even when soloing. Of course, lockpicks, you don't want to have to pass by a treasure chest. So just be prepared for anything and everything, and you should be good to go. Next up on our list is number 6, and this is going to have to do with managing your buffs and debuffs while playing solo. First, let's talk about buffs and buff management, which can be kind of difficult in ESO, especially for newer players, and especially when you're getting pounded on when you're trying to solo your way through a dungeon. First, keep in mind, you don't need to maintain every single buff in the game or everything that's available to your character, not at all. You want to focus on the best buffs. What's most important, especially when it comes to maintaining your damage and defense. If you're a stamina build, you'll want to maintain Major Brutality, whichever buff you have for that. That's a 20% bonus to weapon damage. For Magicka builds, you'll want the same type of buff called Major Sorcery. That's 20% spell damage. Now, most classes get both of these buffs as part of their class kit, but specifically the Templar and the Necromancer do not. So you'll need to fill in with either a potion or skills from other skill lines. For example, the two-handed skill line, the skill Rally gives you Major Brutality. In the Mage's Guild, you can get Major Sorcery from Degeneration. So make sure, however you get that buff, that you have it and you maintain it 100% of the time. Another important buff to maintain is your critical chance, and this is called either Major Savagery for weapon critical or Major Prophecy for spell critical. This gives you like roughly 12% critical chance or so, which is a lot. It makes a big difference. Now, Magicka builds can get this buff passively by slotting the Mages Guild skill Inner Light. The Stamina builds can also get the buff passively from the Fighters Guild with the skill Camouflage Hunter. Now, both of these provide other stats or bonuses passively as well, so they are definitely worth slotting even just as a passive skill on your front bar. Now, finally, the armor buff Major Resolve is available to all classes in some form and is also extremely important. This buff gives you about 6,000 spell and physical resistance, giving you a ton of built-in damage reduction on your build as long as you have that buff active. This is going to be even more important when you're playing completely solo, as you're going to be taking a lot of hits no matter what you do, and you want those hits to deal less damage to your character, so again, keep that armor buff up as much as possible. Now, debuffs are also important, especially in dungeons, and the main debuff you'll want to focus on is reducing enemy armor. Now, usually this is done by a tank in a group setting, but if you're truly playing solo, you'll need a skill to manage this yourself. And the reason why is because enemies in dungeons generally have twice the amount of armor as enemies in overland zones. That means if you don't debuff that armor, your attacks won't do nearly enough damage, and you'll be pounding on them all day long. Now, there are several different skills available for this. For Magicka builds, I definitely recommend Elemental Drain from the Destruction Staff, which will debuff that armor as well as give you Magicka Sustain back. Now, for stamina builds, some do have built-in armor debuffs in their class skills, but one skill that you'll definitely want to consider is Razor Caltrops from the Assault skill line. This debuffs enemy armor in the surrounding AoE, which is really effective. Now, on top of that, definitely consider using the Lover Mundus Stone, which gives you a great boost to your offensive penetration, as well as front barring the Sharpen trait on your weapon for even more damage potential. Tip number 5 is to pay attention to mechanics and do your best to avoid damage at all times. Now, damage mechanics in ESO come in a variety of forms, whether it's, boss heavy attacks, channeled attacks that can be interrupted, AoE attacks, environmental damage. There's many things that you need to watch out for, especially in dungeons. Dungeons are basically built around damage mechanics that you need to learn and you need to avoid if at all possible. Now, let's start with the basics, specifically heavy attacks. And heavy attacks from bosses are even worse. If you don't avoid these, they can sometimes one-shot you, they can knock you down flat, give you a stun. So these need to be blocked or roll dodged if possible. Now, the good thing about heavy attacks is they are usually telegraphed well in advance. You have like this light-colored radiating lines coming from the boss. Those lines are telling you that a heavy attack is on the way, so you need to either block or roll dodge. Another significant source of damage is going to be ground-based AoE. This is typically shown on the ground with a red colored marker that shows the area that you're going to want to avoid so that you don't take damage. In most cases, you'll be able to move quickly enough away from that area to limit your damage taken if you keep moving, so it's usually best to just stay mobile. Some bosses like this one, for example, have more complex AoE patterns that you'll need to learn the timing of if you want to avoid damage entirely. Now, also the color here, keep in mind this is totally customizable in the gameplay menu. Under gameplay and combat colors, you can choose different color sets, you can make them brighter or darker. For me, I usually like something very light, something bright colored, so those AoEs stand out more against the background, and it makes it easier for me to notice them and hopefully avoid them. Finally, let's talk briefly about channeled attacks. Now, these don't come just from bosses. Regular enemies can have special channeled attacks as well. And these look similar to the heavy attack, except the lines here are like a reddish color. That's how you know a channel attack is currently in progress. Now, these are very simple to interrupt, and you want to make sure you interrupt them because it's going to stop that channel attack from doing damage. So you either get close to the target and bash interrupt, or if you have a specific skill, Crushing Shock from the Destruction Staff does this, for example. You can use that as well. So again, pay attention to mechanics. If mechanics are killing you, then learn them, memorize them, and how to avoid them, and you should be able to survive a lot longer. Tip number 4 on our list is learning how to sustain on your build, which means always having enough resources to cast your skills or to block or roll dodge when you need to. And if you run out of resources while attempting to solo a dungeon, you are most likely dead, so this tip is really important. Now, there are many ways to manage your sustain on a build, but some of the easiest are choosing the right food and using the right potions. We talked about this a bit earlier when we talked about having consumables all the time, but how do you know what the right consumable is for your build, right? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out, actually. If you're using your skills in like a normal rotation and your resource is just chugging all the way down to 0, well, you need to build in some more sustain. You don't have enough. Now, I know some players like that max stat food, the one that gives you like health and either magicka or stamina, because it gives you the biggest damage numbers. But if you're specifically trying to solo something like a dungeon, I would recommend something with more recovery. Some of the best options here are Dubious Cameron Throne for stamina builds and Witch Mother's Potent Brew for magicka builds. Not only is this food very common and therefore cheap to buy, it also combines your main offensive stats with health and recovery, giving you basically everything you need to solo in one food. It's a great option. Now, in terms of potions, just to throw out the idea, I do like tri-stat potions. I know they're expensive. You can also get the free daily reward potions, like the tri-stat crown store potions. Either way, these are actually really good for soloing dungeons because they give you a big chunk of all your resources back whenever you need it most. And having health, magicka, and stamina back anytime is always a good thing. I mean, magicka builds need stamina to block and roll dodge. Stamina builds usually need some magicka to cast specific buffs and debuffs. Plus that extra heal, it's almost like a mini burst heal. It's great to have these potions on hand for emergencies. And we also talked about earlier how using a potion gives you very specific buffs. The fortitude, intellect, and endurance buffs, those increase all of your recoveries by 30%, which is going to help a lot with sustain over time. Now, a couple final tricks for sustain I think are worth mentioning. If you are on a magicka build, for example, you'll most likely be using Destruction Staff, which comes in with a built-in sustain skill called Elemental Drain. You basically apply this to a target, it debuffs their armor, and it gives you passive magicka sustain. This is really good, especially on boss fights. Unfortunately, stamina builds don't have an equivalent skill or debuff, but something I do like on my stamina solo builds is running Dizzying Swing from the two-handed skill line. This skill actually sets enemies off balance, and if you heavy attack an off-balance target, that's going to restore double the resources, which is a massive gain for your build. Then you can consider your glyphs as well, including your jewelry and your weapon glyph, specifically something on your weapon like Absorb Stamina or Absorb Magicka as your main weapon glyph can make a big difference. So that's something I definitely use on my solo builds. And then don't forget your champion point. Something you might want to spec into early is either Bloody Renewal or Siphoning Spells. This can give you up to 1,500 resources back per kill. That's a huge amount. You can also increase your magicka recovery while sprinting, increase your overall recovery while you have a negative effect on you, or just general like flat recovery stats. There's lots of good options in the champion point tree. So if you're struggling in this area, make sure you look at every single way you can increase it. Next up on our list, we have tip number 3, which has to do with self-healing. And what we mean here is that you want as many sources of self-healing as possible if you're going to play solo. This includes burst heals, healing over time, as well as passive healing. And the more you have, obviously, the better. Now first, burst heals like Rally, for example, give you a big boost of health back, which can be great for counteracting a boss heavy attack, for example, or if you miss a mechanic and you take a big chunk of damage. Generally though, I would say the best and most efficient option for healing in ESO is going to be healing over time or passive heals, where you don't need to do much to maintain your health. A great example of this is the passive healing that Magicka Templars get from using the skill Puncturing Sweep. Basically, the more damage you do with this skill and the more enemies you hit, the more healing you get back. While not quite as good, sorcerers also have a great passive heal in the Critical Surge skill. This ability heals once per second whenever you deal critical damage, and the heals can get really big if you optimize your build correctly. Now, if your class doesn't have a skill quite like this, you can use heal over time skills like Echoing Vigor, for example. These are great options too. You'll just need to learn how and when to cast these to be the most effective. With skills like Echoing Vigor, it's best not to wait until you're super low health to cast them because they just won't catch you up quick enough. You want to cast those early, as soon as you start to take a little bit of damage. That way the skill has time to catch your health back up. And if you absolutely are struggling here, then check out sets and especially mythics. Something like Ring of the Pale Order, for example, or other sets that heal you when you do damage. These can be a big help, since they are 100% passive, letting you focus on damaging the boss, doing dungeon mechanics, all the while getting health back for free. These are a great tool for survivability. Number 2 on our list is a relatively new addition to the game, and that is to use a companion specifically to help you through a dungeon. The companions are basically there to help fill a role in your build that you lack. At least this is how I see it. So for example, we just talked about self-healing. If your build lacks healing or you don't have, let's say, a Ring of the Pale Order yet, well, a companion can fill in that role just as well, and in some cases even better, providing direct heals, healing over time, buffs, and even extra damage. Companions are very customizable in this way. Another option would be if you lack, let's say, the tankiness, or you just want to focus on maximizing your damage, playing as a DPS, well then you could spec your companion as a tank. Have them absorb all the damage for you while you DPS and you focus on those dungeon mechanics. Now, while companions are a solid addition to the game, I will say they definitely are not perfect. Even with the companion, you won't be able to solo, every single dungeon in the game, because there are just some mechanics where you need other players. And if you don't have your companion fully optimized, they will die. You will have to res them, so that can be a detriment to using them in a dungeon as well. But at the end of the day, I think they do make it easier for players if you want to solo in ESO, and they are well worth investing into if you like this particular style of gameplay. And that brings us to the number 1 tip for soloing dungeons in ESO. This is my tried and true secret that I rely on pretty much on all of my builds in some way, and that is using damage shields. And I know what you're thinking, damage shields are just for mag sorks or light armor builds, but no. In fact, damage shields in ESO can be used on any build in the game. You can stack multiple shields together, 3, 4, even 5 at a time, to give you some insane survivability, letting you effectively solo some really difficult content. I love using shields for this reason. You can combine shields from skills like Hardened Ward or Bone Shield, Brawler, Temporal Guard, tons of different skills with shields from gear sets. Some really powerful gear sets that have shields now are Hexos Ward from Deadlands. You could use Prayer Shawl, even Ice Heart. Also, don't forget that there is a shield glyph that can be added to either your front or your back bar weapon, which if you combine that with an infused trait on that weapon, you can get an extra shield just by light or heavy attacking that's also very strong. Basically, there are tons of options here that you can easily mix and match into your build to increase your survival and allow you to solo some more difficult content. Now, how this works is damage shields essentially act like an extra health bar. Enemies have to break through this before they can take away from your actual health. So for example, let's say you have 20k health on your build, but you can also stack a few shields to get 20k in shields. Now your build has quote-unquote health at 40k. And that extra health from the shield can be instantly refreshed, in some cases for free, if you're using that damage shield glyph that we talked about earlier, or those sets that I mentioned. So that's basically my secret for maximum survival while soloing ESO. Whether I'm on a stamina, a magicka, or even a hybrid build, get those damage shields, combine that with all the other tips we mentioned in this video, and you'll do some amazing things. Now, if you liked the video today, do us a favor and crush that like button. We post solo builds and all kinds of other builds for ESO here on the channel, so make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you'd like to see even more ESO content, we do have a YouTube membership where we post some exclusive and very unique builds for our channel members, like our latest build you're watching now in the background. This is called the Barbarian. This build actually works by using no class skills at all, so it can really be made on any class that you want. And it also has over 10,000 weapon damage, so it just tears through enemies. Plus we have the shields, we have the self-healing, all the stuff we talked about in this video wrapped into one build. So if that's something that interests you, or you just want to see the other videos that we have available for members, click on that join button down below for more information. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.